All right, we've gotten through some of the nuts and bolts of how to play and think about poker. Now it's time to discuss pre-flop poker strategy. This is strategy before the flop. So let's first discuss some starting hands. So which starting hands are generally thought to be the best? Well, it turns out the best starting hands are hands that can make strong, big pairs, or that have the potential to make an incredibly premium hand, like a flush or a straight or three of a kind. So the best hands you can have are big pocket pairs. This can be pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks. These are very, very strong hands that you can be happy investing a decent amount of money with. Next, strong big cards like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, king queen. Whenever these hands do make a pair, it's usually the best pair with a very strong kicker, the side card, right? So these hands are quite strong. Next, medium pairs are pretty good. Sometimes a medium pair by itself is just good enough to win at the river, but also medium pairs will make three of a kind sometimes. And when you make three of a kind, that's usually a pretty good hand. Next, suited aces, like ace eight of diamonds, ace five of clubs, ace queen of spades. These hands are particularly good because when they do make top pair, top pair, top kicker, like say it does come 8-7-3, ace eight's pretty good on 8-7-3, becomes ace 3-2. Ace eight's pretty good there too. But it also makes the best flush, referred to as the nut flush. That hand is really good and is almost always the best. So suited aces are pretty strong. Suited connectors are pretty strong as well. Hands like 8-7 suited, jack 10 suited, 10-9 suited. Even hands like 9-7 suited or jack 9 suited, hands with a gap in between. As long as they're suited, they're pretty strong too because they will make some flushes, they'll make some straights, they'll make some decent middle pairs, and those are all pretty reasonable hands. And then finally, weak pocket pairs. These are pocket 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s. They are not like incredibly premium, but when they do make three of a kind, you're usually pretty happy. So these are generally the best starting hands, and you're not going to want to play all of these all the time. Like, for example, in terms of strong big cards, a hand like ace 10 is pretty good, but if there's a lot of betting before you, it may become significantly weaker. Also, suited connectors like 4-3 of diamonds aren't actually all that good because they usually make low flushes and low straights. So these hands are pretty strong. You should play them in most scenarios, but there certainly will be situations where you should not play them, and we'll be discussing that in a minute. Now, the worst starting hands, these are hands you very rarely want to play. Although, again, there are exceptions to everything. We'll be discussing that later throughout this course. So the worst starting hands are junky connected cards like 8-6 offsuit or 8-4 offsuit or 7-5 offsuit. These hands may feel good. They may look good. A lot of people think they're very playable, but you don't make straights all that often. And then you're just left with a bad pair with a bad kicker when you do connect with the board. And a bad pair with a bad kicker is not really where you want to be. Next, junky suited cards like jack 3 of diamonds. These are just not that strong of hands because kind of like the junky connected cards, you don't make a flush all that often. And when you do make a pair, it's usually not a very good one. Some of the worst hands are a big card with a little card. I know that I lost a ton of money as a young poker player because I would play any ace. Ace 6 offsuit, sign me up. I would be raising and re-raising because, hey, you have the best card in the deck, right? No, turns out that's not true because if your opponents are trying to get all their money in as well, they're going to have you what's referred to as dominated. They're going to have ace king or ace queen when I'm sitting there with ace 6, right? Turns out ace queen crushes ace 6. So big card and little card are particularly bad. And then hands that are obviously bad, like unconnected low cards, 8-2, 7-2, 6-3, offsuits. These hands are very, very bad and unplayable in almost all scenarios. One thing that does confuse people is that they have a difficult time with the idea of hand rankings because they want to think that a hand is like always better than another hand. And while there are some hands that are just better than others, like pocket aces is better than 7-2 every time, realize that these hand values kind of change a little bit depending on board texture, the number of players you're against, etc. So just to show you that very briefly, take ace king offsuit and run it against pocket twos. This is solved using a program called Equilab, E-Q-U-I-L-A-B. It's completely free. You can download it. It only works on Windows, but I'm sure there are Mac equivalents out there. As you see here, ace king offsuit will beat or lose to pocket twos, right? On average, pocket twos wins 52.65% of the time if you ran the situation a million times. And, to be fair, you do need to be thinking about poker in the terms of long term. You can't think, I had pocket twos and I lost to the ace king, therefore ace king is way better in every scenario, right? It doesn't really work like that. If you did get it all in before the flop with these two hands, you see pocket twos actually beats ace king a little bit more often. However, take jack 10 suited, right below it here, we see jack 10 suited is actually better than pocket twos if you ran it against each other. And it turns out it's generally thought that ace king and jack 10 suited are both pretty strong hands because, ace king can always just make top pair, top kicker. Jack 10 suited can make straights and flushes, and it has a lot of potential when you see the flop with it, because usually you're going to flop a straight draw or a flush draw or something. Whereas pocket twos, usually it's a bad pair. So different hands thrive in different scenarios. It turns out the small pairs are quite good whenever you have relatively few big blinds. Remember how I discussed earlier the effective stack size? This is where that kind of concept starts to become very, very important, because some hands are much better when you're deep stacked, and some hands are much better when you are shallow stacked. Then, however, if you run ace king against jack 10 suited, you see ace king just crushes jack 10 suited. So we have this like a triangle, right, where ace king loses to twos, but ace king beats jack 10, but jack 10 beats twos. So don't get stuck in your head thinking, this hand's always better than this one, so I need to always play this hand and never play this hand. Poker is a difficult game, and I'm going to do my best throughout this course to simplify it for you. But realize that you want to play good hands. If you play a lot of bad hands, you should expect your money to go to your opponents. Now that you know which hands are generally playable and which hands are generally not playable, let's discuss the three main reasons to bet in No Limit Texas Hold'em. And they are for value, for protection, and as a bluff. So let's go through these one by one. A value bet is when you are betting because you want worse hands to call you. This is when you have a hand like the nuts. The nuts are the best possible hand. Before the flop, whenever you have a pair of aces, you have the best possible hand. In this scenario, you want your opponents to call you because whenever they put money in the pot, some of that is going to be going to you because you are the person most likely to win the hand when you have the best hand. So when you are betting for value, it's very important that you make sure that worse hands can realistically call you. This will sometimes occur on the flop, the turn, or the river, where let's say you have a hand that's probably the best hand, but if you bet and your opponent calls you, you may not. We will be giving some examples of this later in this course, and also we discuss this thoroughly in the homework challenges at pokercoaching.com, so make sure you check those out. When you are betting, you can either be betting a premium hand, like the nuts, or a decent but marginal hand. This is referred to as betting for thin value. When you bet for thin value, you're betting a hand. Let's say someone raises before the flop and you decide to re-raise with a hand like ace queen, right? If you re-raise ace queen and the initial raiser then re-raises you, at that point, you're not really loving it anymore, right? But if you raise with ace queen and they just call you, now they're probably going to have a whole lot of hands worse than ace queen because they would have re-raised with the better hands, right? So in that scenario, you are re-raising for thin value. The next reason is for essentially protection. This is a broad concept that sometimes gets put into the value category, but there are many times where you have a hand like top pair bad kicker after the flop, where you have the best hand but a bad kicker, and you're betting because if your opponents fold, they're usually folding out some hands that could outdraw you some portion of the time. Like let's say the board comes 9-8-3 and you have queen 9. In that scenario, if you bet and your opponents fold out a hand like king jack, yeah, you had the best hand at the moment, but if they get a king or a jack, they beat you. So you don't really care if they fold because they are going to outdraw you sometimes, and if they fold out that hand, that's a reasonable success. The final reason to bet is as a bluff. And when you are bluffing, you are betting because you want better hands to fold. Before the flop, the hands near the bottom of the range of hands that you are going to play are essentially considered to be a bluff. We'll be discussing which hands you should play in all positions in the very next section of this class, so stay tuned for that. When you are bluffing, it can either be a pure bluff or a semi-bluff. A pure bluff is when if you bet and your opponent calls, you just always lose. This is usually going to be occurring on the river, on the last betting round, where you get to the river, you have perhaps a draw that did not improve to a straight or flush on the river, and you're betting knowing that if you get called and you lose, well, you lose the hand. But when you bet with a pure bluff and your opponent folds, they're usually folding out a better hand, which is a huge success. The other reason or the other way to bluff is as a semi-bluff, which is what most of your bluffs will be. If you think back to the hands that are generally playable before the flop, say everyone folds to you and you raise with a hand like 8-7 of spades, right? 8-7 of spades here is very likely the worst hand at the moment if you raise and get called, because people are going to call you with Jack 10 and Ace 3. So 8-7 of spades is actually, behind at the moment because Ace high beats 8 high. But this hand has a huge amount of potential to improve on the later betting rounds. So before the flop, you're going to find that a lot of the ideas of value betting or bluffing doesn't necessarily apply because every hand will win some portion of the time. Let's say, for example, someone raises and then you re-raise with Ace-8 of diamonds. When you re-raise with Ace-8 of diamonds and they call, you're probably behind. But if you get an ace, or if you get an 8, or if you get 3 of a kind, or if you get a flush, you're going to be very, very happy, right? So the idea of a semi-bluff is you are applying aggression with the idea that if they fold, that's great. And if they call, you still have a chance to improve on a later betting round. So before the flop, if someone raises and you re-raise with a hand like kings or ace-queen, in that scenario, you're re-raising for value, right? When you re-raise a hand like ace-8 suited or 8-7 suited, you're re-raising as a bluff. If you happen to re-raise with a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 3s, it would essentially be for thin value / protection. But as you're about to see in the upcoming sections, you're really not going to be re-raising with a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 3s all that often. So anyway, these are the 3 broad terms. We will use these terms throughout this course: value, protection, and bluff. So I just want to make you aware of what those mean before we move forward and get really in depth on how to play before the flop. Now let's discuss a few specific scenarios that you are certain to encounter at the poker table on a very regular basis. The first is when everyone folds to you before the flop. This is specifically when all the players to your right, besides the blinds, right? When all the players to your right have folded to you, that is when this section will apply. Okay? If people call the big blind before you, this does not apply. If people raise before you, this does not apply. I want to make sure that is very, very clear. We'll be discussing those situations shortly. Before we do get to that, though, it's important that you understand the idea of ranges. In all spots, recognize that you are actually playing your range and not your specific hand. Even though you may look down at your cards and you see that you have, let's say, Queen Jack of diamonds, realize that you would also play King Jack of diamonds in exactly the same way, and Jack 10 of diamonds, and maybe 10-9 of diamonds, and a pair of 7s, and a pair of aces, right? So if you would play all these hands in the same manner, realize that is essentially your range. And by playing all the hands that you would like to play in a similar manner, especially before the flop, that will make you much more difficult to play against. Also realize the same goes for your opponent. If you raise from, let's say, on the button, and the player in the big blind decides to call, realize they could have Queen Jack offsuit, or they could have 8-7 suited. You have no idea of knowing what they have. And it's important that you do not put your opponents on exactly one specific hand because, well, you're going to be wrong a lot. And also, it's just not how poker works. You do not know specifically which 2 cards your opponent has, and they don't know specifically what you have, right? So this makes it impossible for your opponent to know what you have when you play all of the hands in the same manner. And when you do that, that will result in your opponent making mistakes. And you make money from poker when your opponents make mistakes. Let me briefly show you how to read a hand ranking chart. We'll be giving you a lot of hand ranking charts in this course. So I want to make sure you fully understand how to use them. Taking a look at this, we have the pairs in red here. The pairs go down the diagonal. As you see, we have a pair of aces at the top, a pair of 2s at the bottom. The suited hands are in the top right quadrant, and the offsuit hands, the unsuited hands, are in the bottom left quadrant. The O here means offsuit. The S up here means suited. It's worth noting that generally the stronger hands are in the top left-hand quadrant. That's because these are the hands that have the highest cards, right? And the highest cards make the highest pairs, and those are the hands you typically want to play. So let's discuss now when specifically everyone folds to you. When they do fold to you, you should raise or fold. Do not limp in. Do not open limp. It's referred to as open limping when you are the first person to just call the big blind. That's not a good strategy because it lets the player in the big blind just check and see the flop for free. You want to make them pay to play their marginal cards and play from out of position. So, in general, as a default, you're going to want to raise to 3 big blinds when you have more than a 50 big blind stack, and you're going to want to raise to about 2.5 big blinds when you have fewer than 50 big blinds in your stack. Okay? So now let's take a look at which hands to play from all of the positions. One thing you will definitely recognize very clearly here is that you get to play more hands when you are in the later positions. And that's because when you are what's referred to as in position, when you are in the later positions, you have more information about what is going on in the pot. And also, there are fewer players yet to act who can just be randomly dealt a premium hand. Position is very, very powerful, and we will be discussing it thoroughly throughout this course. So, from under the gun, in this scenario, you should raise with these hands in red and fold everything else, right? Nothing fancy. You see that you're just playing the absolute best hands from under the gun. You're playing a pair of sixes and better, so aces to sixes. You're playing ace-3 suited and better, which means ace-king suited to ace-3 suited. Ace-jack offsuit and better. King-9 suited and better. King-queen offsuit. Queen-9 suited and better. Jack-10 suited and 10-9 suited. And that's it. I know a mistake that I had when I first started playing poker is I thought any ace was good. If I was dealt ace-4 offsuit, I would play it from every position because the ace is the best card. Why wouldn't I, right? Well, it turns out you're going to run into problems where you have kicker trouble. You're going to have a pair of aces with a 4 kicker, and your opponent's going to have a pair of aces with a jack kicker, and you're going to lose. So realize that all of these weak aces are not played. Notice even a hand like king-jack offsuit is not played, or jack-10 offsuit, or pocket 4s, or 8-7 offsuit. These are hands that a lot of people think are good because they have high cards. They can make a straight or they're a pair. But it turns out they have a very difficult time playing after the flop because they just make kind of junky hands. And you don't want to have junky hands. You want to have good hands, especially when you have the worst position. And under the gun is the worst position. So from the early positions, you'll see all of them. Under the gun +1, under the gun +2. You're actually playing a pretty tight strategy. You're not playing all that many hands. All right, going on around to under the gun +2. Interestingly enough, you see 9-7 suited and 8-7 suited are not played, but 7-6 suited is. That is because these charts were developed using a very, very high-end poker solver that essentially tells you the optimal strategy, okay? It's well beyond the scope of this course, but if you do see some kind of odd things in there, that is why that is taking place. But in theory, it is what you should do. Next, in the low jack seat, you see you start to play a bit of a wider range, right? You get to raise with king-6 suited and queen-10 offsuit and pocket 3s and 7-6 suited, right? From the hijack seat, you get to play even more hands. From the cutoff seat, we now get to play a pretty good amount of hands. And then we get around to the button. So if everyone folds to you on the button, you actually get to play about 55% of hands. And that may be surprising to some people, like king-5 offsuit. It's pretty good. 10-3 suited. It's good enough, right? 10-7 offsuit. Good enough. And these hands are not necessarily premium hands by any means, but you only have to worry about the small blind and the big blind playing. When you only have to worry about 2 other opponents playing, you get to play many, many more hands. Some people may actually have a different reaction to the button range here. Some people think you're supposed to play all the hands from the button, but that's also not true because you just cannot profitably play junky hands like 10-3 offsuit. It's just not a profitable hand. So if you were to just blindly follow these charts, you would be fine. Recognize though, I don't think you have to memorize these charts because as long as you understand the general principles that come from the charts, you're going to be fine. You want to make sure you're not playing all sorts of junk from the early positions. And you also want to make sure you're not playing too tightly from the late positions. Let's take a look at this outlier chart. Here we have the small blind. And the small blind chart is interesting because first things first, this assumes everyone folds around to you in the small blind, which in most small stakes or casual games is not going to happen all that often. And this chart also assumes the player in the big blind is a very strong player, which, may or may not be the case in your small stakes or casual game. So you always want to make sure you are adjusting from these strategies to take advantage of specifically whatever your opponent does incorrectly. And this requires a bit of logical thought process, right? So let's say everyone folds to you in the small blind and you know the player in the big blind only plays the best hands. If they don't have maybe a pair of sevens or better, or like ace 10 or better, or two big cards, they just fold. Well, in that scenario, you should actually raise with any two cards, all of your hands, because the player in the big blind is going to fold way too often. What if the player in the big blind will re-raise or raise every time you put a chip in the pot from the small blind? Well, now you want to be much more conservative from the small blind because you're going to frequently face aggression and you don't want to put in money with the marginal hands and just have to fold them, right? So you're going to want to adjust significantly, especially from the later positions, and the small blind is definitely where that is most true. However, from the small blind, this is the proper chart in theory that involves some limping, some calling of the big blind. And the reason for that is because you're putting in half of a big blind to try to win two big blinds in the pot, which means you're only putting in 25% of the pot, which is not all that much. And whenever you're getting essentially a discount to try to play the pot, you get to play a much wider range. And the reason you're just calling with some of the absolute best hands up here is because you want to make it to where when you do just call the big blind, you don't have all garbage, right? A big mistake a lot of players make is they always raise and re-raise with their absolute best hands, and they always call with their marginal hands and their garbage, but that's a big mistake. And it turns out limping, just calling with the best hands here, allows you to also profitably limp with some of these weaker hands in the bottom because your opponent just can't mindlessly raise your limp because you're going to show up with aces and kings and ace-king some portion of the time. In terms of other adjustments you can make away from these charts, like I said, from the later positions, that is when you should be making more adjustments. So usually from the cutoff or the button, you can't really make a whole lot of adjustments from the early positions. And that's because from the early positions, you just have to worry about everyone yet to act waking up with a strong hand just purely based on chance, right? But from the button, let's say you know the player in the small blind and the player in the big blind are both pretty tight. They only play the best hands. Well, in that scenario, instead of raising 54.8% of hands on the button, you should actually raise much more, perhaps 100% of hands, depending on how tight they are. And, alternatively, if you know they're going to be re-raising you, if you raise to, let's say, $6 at a 1-2 game, you know they're going to make it $25 every time. Well, now you would not want to play a lot of these hands at the bottom of the range. And when I say the bottom of the range, I mean hands that are on the cusp of playability, like 10-3 suited, maybe even like Jack-4 suited and Jack-8 offsuit and King-7 offsuit, right? The hands that are kind of near where the pink touches the white in these scenarios. So definitely do not blindly memorize these charts and use them in all scenarios, right? You want to make sure you're adjusting to whatever your opponent's doing correctly. And fortunately, in the small stakes poker games, your opponents will do a whole lot of incorrect things because they're not all that good at poker players yet. We're going to be giving you a few questions to make sure you fully understand these charts and also some adjustments you should make. And as we continue progressing through this course, you will see a lot of the adjustments we are making in practice, and that's going to let you know how to deviate from these charts. But when you are just getting started, printing out these charts and following them is probably a pretty good strategy that will result in you not finding yourself in too many overly difficult spots. Something a lot of people do is they just play way, way, way too loosely. They see a hand like King-8 offsuit and think, oh, I have a king, it's good. But if you look at these charts, King-8 offsuit is not actually played until you're on the button. So do not be like your opponents. All of your opponents are probably going to play way too loosely, and you are going to take their money because you are not making the same mistakes that they are. Now let's discuss the situation where you make a pre-flop raise when everyone folds to you, and then someone yet to act 3-bets you. A 3-bet means a re-raise. So this is a scenario where, let's say you raise to $6 at a 1-2 no limit cash game, and then someone yet to act makes it $20. What should you do when everyone folds back around to you? This term 3-bet, by the way, gives a few people some confusion. This term comes from an antiquated game called Limit Hold'em, where the big blind was considered the first bet, the initial raise was considered the second bet, and then if someone wanted to re-raise, that was considered the third bet. For some reason, that term has stuck to No Limit Hold'em, so it is what it is. It does not say anything about the size of the re-raise. It just simply means this is the re-raise. This is the third bet being put into the pot. All right. When you are in this scenario, you need to consider 4 main ideas. The first is, what is your opponent's strategy? As they play a looser range, you, in turn, should play more hands. Remember, you're always considering your opponent's range because you don't know if they have pocket aces or if they are bluffing with ace-4 offsuit, right? But you will have some idea of how frequently your opponent is making a 3-bet. Some players will 3-bet a lot, and some players will 3-bet very little. Let's say you're playing against a player who you have never seen 3-bet over the course of playing with them for 8 hours. Well, they probably have a really good hand. Probably exactly pocket aces and maybe pocket kings or queens or ace king. So if you're sitting there with something like ace 10 suited, that's normally a pretty good hand. But if you know your opponent has legitimately only aces, kings, queens, or ace king, or if that's what you presume is happening in this scenario because of the play you've observed, then you should just fold, right? Alternatively, say you've played with someone and they 3-bet every other hand. Ace 10 suited is a really good hand that you are literally never folding and you're very happy to put your money in the pot, right? So your opponent's strategy is very important. As they play looser ranges, you get to continue with more ranges, or with more hands, with a wider range. If they are playing a tighter range, you have to continue in turn with a tighter range. Next, the 3-bet amount is important. If you raise, let's say $6 at that 1-2 no limit game and someone 3-bets to $12, you should actually continue with a lot of hands because you're putting in $6 to try to win a pot that's going to be $24 or so. Whenever you're putting in a tiny portion of the pot, you just don't have to win all that often. Alternatively, if you make it $6 and your opponent makes it $40, which will happen in some small stakes games, well, now you should fold almost everything because your opponent's risking a lot to win relatively little. So, as the 3-bet size is smaller, you should typically continue with more hands, and when it's larger, you should continue with fewer hands. Also, your position is generally important. When you raise from later positions and get 3-bet, you should actually continue with a wider range of hands overall because your opponent is aware that you are raising from the later position, so you should have a wide range to begin with. So in turn, they are going to 3-bet you with a wide range, which in turn makes you have to defend with a wide range. If you're raising from earlier position, like let's say you raise ace-jack offsuit from early position, from under the gun, let's say, and then a player in the hijack seat 3-bets you, well, ace-jack offsuit is probably in pretty bad shape, right? So you should just fold there. But if you raise ace-jack from the cutoff and the button 3-bets you, you're not folding because the button should have a much wider 3-betting range. Also, your opponent's position is very relevant in relation to you because when you are in position, when you're going to be the player acting last on the flop, you get to play more hands because you have position. When you are last to act, you generally just get to play more hands. And also, you're going to find that when you are last to act, you want to do just a whole lot more calling in general because you want to keep the stacks remaining to be bet on the later betting rounds very deep compared to the size of the pot. Whereas when you are out of position against your opponent, you would rather just go ahead and get your money in with your hands that are favorite because it's difficult to play from out of position. So let me give you an example. Again, this is how you should play if you are playing against a very strong opponent. But let me show you these two charts. We'll take this very slowly. So let's say we have on the left the cutoff versus a button 3-bet, and then on the right we have the cutoff versus a big blind 3-bet. Let's focus on the chart on the left first. This is when you raise from the cutoff, and the button, who is a strong player, the button is the dealer button, the button 3-bets you. So this is when you raise from the cutoff, the dealer button 3-bets you, and then the small blind and big blind fold, and then it's back on you. This is how you should proceed. you should 4-bet for value with your absolute best hands, these hands here in red. You should 4-bet as a bluff with a few sporadic bluffs. And this is something a lot of people never do. What they do instead is they only 4-bet with their absolute best hands. And if you do that, that makes your opponent's life really easy, right? They can just fold everything that's not very strong. So you always want to make sure, assuming you're playing against decently strong opponents who are also 3-betting with some bluffs, that your 4-betting range contains some bluffs. And you're going to usually find that some of the best bluffing hands are hands that contain a high card that are not good enough to call, or like barely good enough to call. And that's because when you have a high card in your hand, like in this scenario, take a look, an ace or a king, it makes it less likely that the 3-better has an ace or king in their hand because you have one in your hand, right? And because of that, that makes your opponent a little bit less likely to have pocket aces or pocket kings or ace king, and that is actually very relevant. So let's take a look at this. In this scenario, we are 4-betting for value with the hands in red. We're 4-betting as a bluff with the hands in blue, and then we're calling all these hands in green. But we're folding 45% of our range. These numbers here on the very far right are the percentage of the range that we started with, so all the hands that are not in range hands. That's the percentage of the time that you are continuing after you, or the percentage of the time you're making each play after you have already entered the pot. This percentage here is the percentage of the total number of hands, which is not relevant in this scenario. And this number here is actually the total number of combinations of hands that are available. We're not going to get into that in this course, but as you go deeper in the content at pokercoaching.com, we will be discussing those numbers a decent amount. The percentages are really all that matter, though. So in this scenario, we are folding out 45% of the time, okay? And that's because we are going to be out of position. Remember, we raise the cutoff, and then the dealer button 3-bet us. So we have to go first after the flop. Okay, let's compare that to when we were against a big blind player. So now we raise the cutoff, the big blind 3-bets. Now we are going to be in position against them. There are a few things you should notice about the differences between these two charts. The first is that you are 4-betting way less often, both for value and as a bluff. And that's because when you're in position, you want to keep the stacks yet to be bet on the later betting rounds deep. And that's because you just get more information, which will result in you making better decisions when you are in position. So notice in this scenario, we're 4-betting for value 11.7% of the time, whereas when we're out of position, when we're in position, we're 4-betting 5.7% of the time, so like half as often. You're going to find that when you're 4-betting for value less often, you also 4-bet as a bluff less often, which makes logical sense because your bluff ratio actually is in proportion to your value ratio. You should typically have, in most scenarios, about 1 bluff to 2 value hands. In most scenarios. We're not going to get too deep into that, though. But we could go deep on that. We go deep in that over at pokercoaching.com. All right. Next, notice that you're folding less. So in the scenario against the button, you're folding 45% of hands. But against the big blind, you're folding 36% of hands. So about 8% less. And that's because we, again, are in position. So when you're in position, you get to just continue. You get to call with way more hands. And that is important to know, right? If we looked at the same scenario, though, and we were against a very tight player who was only 3-betting with the absolute best hands, now instead of calling quite as wide in, let's say, this cutoff versus big blind scenario, we would be folding more, right? If we were against a much looser player, we would probably be bluffing a little bit more, right? Because if our opponent's range is too wide, he's going to have a difficult time defending against a 4-bet. So we'd actually have more bluffs in that scenario. And we would continue with a lot of these other hands that are being folded that tend to be in decent shape against our opponent's 3-betting range. So please do not think you have to memorize this specific chart at all. This is mainly to show you how you want to defend against a strong opponent. But remember, in this scenario, you always want to consider your opponent's strategy, the 3-bet size, your opening position, which should in turn affect your opponent's 3-betting strategy, and also your opponent's position, which will very much impact how you continue. And we'll be going through many more situations like this throughout the course that will give you a much better idea of how to continue when you get 3-bet in all sorts of scenarios.